What if the thing you were running from was the very thing that could save your life? In a land ruled by snow, fire, and violence, a woman and a broken cowboy must stand together or lose everything. This isn't just a story about the Wild West. It's about love, motherhood, sacrifice, and the invisible bond between people. The meaning of this story, the greatest courage, is choosing to stay. If you believe in stories like this, like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the narrow alleyway, followed instantly by the thud of 200 pounds of dead weight hitting the dirt. Evelyn Vance stood over the groaning man, her chest heaving, her knuckles white around the handle of a massive cast-iron skillet. The thug, one of her brother-in-law Silas's hired muscle, had cornered her behind the boarding house, his greasy fingers tearing at her hand to strip the gold wedding band from her finger. He had underestimated her. Everyone always did. Evie didn't wait for him to recover. She shoved the heavy skillet back into her canvas sack, her hands trembling so violently she could barely draw the drawstring. "Don't let Silas take the cracked pot, Evie. Whatever you do, keep it safe." Arthur's dying words rattled in her skull, a frantic whisper that had made no sense a week ago. Her husband had died as he lived, drowning in debt, sweating with fever, and leaving her to face the wolves he'd invited to their door. Silas Vance wasn't just a corrupt railroad financier. He was a ruthless loan shark who owned half the politicians in Denver. When Arthur died, Silas didn't offer condolences. He offered an eviction notice, seizing their home, their bank accounts, and every piece of furniture to settle Arthur's mysterious debts. Evie had walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a canvas sack containing 3 items the debt collectors had deemed worthless garbage: her mother's wooden spoon, the cast-iron skillet, and a ridiculously heavy cracked clay-bottomed pot that Arthur had obsessively guarded in his final days. She pulled her thin wool shawl tighter against the biting autumn wind. She had to get out of Denver. Silas was hunting her, and if his men caught her, she wouldn't survive the night. An hour later, Evie stood in a dimly lit pawn shop, sliding her gold wedding band across the scratched glass counter. It was the last piece of her past, the last remnant of a marriage built on lies and unpaid bills. "Enough for passage on the next freight wagon heading high into the mountains," Evie told the pawnbroker, her voice stripped of all its former city wife polish. "Colorado high country, as far from here as it goes." By nightfall, she was wedged between crates of mining supplies on a rough-hewn freight wagon, the bitter cold of the ascending altitude sinking into her bones. For 2 days, the wagon groaned up treacherous mountain passes. Evie barely slept, clutching her canvas sack to her chest, the unnatural weight of the clay-bottomed pot bruising her ribs with every jolt. But the mountains cared nothing for desperate women. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sky bruised a violent, unnatural purple. The temperature plummeted so fast it stole the breath from Evie's lungs. An early-season blizzard swept down the jagged peaks, a blinding wall of white fury that reduced visibility to mere feet. The wagon lurched to a halt. "This is it, widow!" the driver shouted over the howling wind. He didn't even bother to look back at her. "I ain't risking my mules off the main trail in this whiteout. Get down!" Evie scrambled off the tailgate, her thin leather boots sinking knee-deep into the snow. "You said you'd take me to the settlement. Settlement snowed in." The driver tossed her canvas bag down beside her. "Sterling Ranch is about a mile up that ridge path. May God have mercy on you, because this mountain won't." Before Evie could protest, the driver cracked his whip and the wagon vanished into the blinding snow. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She was completely alone. The wind screamed through the pines, driving icy needles into her cheeks. Her limbs were already growing numb, her damp skirts freezing into stiff boards around her ankles. "Keep moving." She slung the heavy canvas sack over her shoulder and turned toward the faint rising path the driver had pointed out. Every step was a battle against the rising drifts. The snow sapped her strength, dragging at her boots, but the sheer terror of freezing to death pushed her forward. 1 mile. It might as well have been 100. Her breath crystallized in the air. Her fingers lost all feeling. The crushing weight of the clay pot in her bag felt like an anchor pulling her down into the snow. She stumbled, falling hard to her knees. The cold was insidious, shifting from a sharp agony to a deceptive, sleepy warmth. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. No. Evie bit her own lip until she tasted copper. She forced herself back to her feet, dragging her left leg, then her right. Through the swirling whiteout, a massive shape loomed ahead. Heavy wrought iron hinges, thick wooden posts, the gates of a ranch. Evie lunged for the timber, her frozen fingers desperately clawing at the icy wood. She had no strength left to shout. Her vision tunneled, the world fading into a quiet, muffled gray. She sank to the ground against the unyielding gate, her arms wrapped fiercely around her canvas bag, and let the darkness take her. Wyatt Sterling did not believe in ghosts, but he lived with one every day. He pulled the collar of his heavy shearling coat up against the biting wind. His Winchester rifle balanced easily in one gloved hand. The blizzard had come early, a violent reminder of the storm that had taken everything from him 3 years ago. He was doing his final perimeter check, making sure the cattle were huddled in the winter windbreaks. As he approached the main gates of the ranch, his sharp eyes caught an irregularity in the snowbank, a shadow that didn't belong. Wyatt cursed under his breath, quickening his pace. He kicked the snowdrift away and froze. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight, miserable ball, a heavy canvas sack clutched against her chest like a shield. Her face was pale as marble, her lips tinged a dangerous, deadly blue. Dropping his rifle into the snow, Wyatt hauled her up. She was dangerously light, nothing but frail bones and frozen cotton. He threw her over his broad shoulder, snatched up her canvas bag, and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the main house. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of stale coffee and loneliness. Wyatt kicked the door shut against the howling wind and laid her on the rug in front of the massive stone hearth. He stoked the dying embers, throwing on 3 fresh logs until a roaring fire chased the freezing shadows from the room. He didn't know who she was, and he didn't care. Once the storm broke, he would put her on a horse and send her down to the settlement. The Sterling Ranch had no room for strays. It took an hour before the color began to creep back into her cheeks. Wyatt sat in a leather armchair a few feet away, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, watching her. Evie gasped, her eyes flying open. She jolted upright, instantly regretting it as a wave of dizziness slammed into her. She scrambled backward away from the fire, her hands frantically searching the floor until her fingers brushed the rough canvas of her bag. Only then did she look up. Sitting in the shadows of the room was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered, with dark hair and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that made Evie's breath catch. They were a pale, piercing gray, cold, empty, and utterly unforgiving. "You're lucky to be breathing," Wyatt said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the room. "Another 10 minutes out there and you'd be a block of ice." Where am I?" Evie's voice was a raspy whisper. "Sterling Ranch. I found you at my gate." Wyatt took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Storm's going to blow for another day. Soon as the pass is clear, I'll have one of my men ride you down to the settlement. You can catch a train back to wherever you came from." Panic flared in Evie's chest. "No, I can't go back. I don't have any money, and—" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his icy gaze. "I'm looking for work." "I need a job." Wyatt let out a short, harsh laugh. "A job? Look at you. You're shaking like a wet leaf, and you look like a stiff breeze could snap you in half. This is a working cattle ranch, lady. It breaks strong men. It'd kill you in a week. I don't run a charity." Evie pushed herself up onto her trembling legs. Her body ached, her clothes were damp, and she was entirely at the mercy of this hardened, bitter stranger. But Silas Vance had tried to break her, and he had failed. She wasn't about to let a mountain cowboy dismiss her. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Sterling," Evie said, her voice steadying, gathering a fierce, quiet strength. "And I'm not asking for charity." She reached down and opened her canvas bag, pulling out the heavy, blackened cast-iron skillet. "I need a roof, and I imagine your men need hot food. Give me ingredients and a fire, and I'll prove I'm worth more than a frozen corpse at your gate." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He stared at her, assessing the bruised, battered woman standing in his parlor holding a frying pan like a weapon. There was a desperate, feral fire in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a survivor. He stood up, towering over her. "Kitchen's through that door. Pantry is nearly empty. We've got dried beef, ancient potatoes, and salt. Show me what you can do. But if you burn my kitchen down, I'll throw you back out into the snow myself." Evie didn't flinch. "Point me to the stove." For the next hour, the silent house was filled with the unfamiliar sounds of chopping, searing, and the rich, savory smell of rendered beef fat and roasted potatoes. Evie worked with practiced efficiency, utilizing her mother's wooden spoon and the heavy iron skillet to coax flavor out of the meager rations. When she finally carried a steaming bowl of thick, hearty stew into the dining room, Wyatt was sitting at the head of a long, empty table. She set it down in front of him, stepping back in silence. Wyatt looked at the bowl. He hadn't eaten a decent meal since Josie died. His men survived on burned bacon and hardtack, their morale as low as the winter temperatures. He picked up his spoon and took a bite. The heat of the stew hit his stomach, rich and grounding. It tasted of care. It tasted of survival. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He set the spoon down and looked up at Evie. The firelight caught the exhausted but defiant angle of her chin. "1 week," Wyatt said, his voice stripped of its earlier mockery. "You get a 1-week trial. You'll cook 3 meals a day for me and 5 ranch hands. You sleep in the small room off the pantry." He leaned forward, the ice in his gray eyes remaining intact. "But understand this, widow. You keep your head down, you do your work, and you don't cause trouble. I don't have the patience for drama." Evie let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Denver. "You won't even know I'm here, Mr. Sterling." She turned and walked back into the kitchen, her trembling hands gripping her apron. She had a roof. She had a fire. And for the first time in months, she had a fighting chance. The cold was a living, breathing entity in the tiny pantry room. It seeped through the cracks in the rough-hewn floorboards, curling around Evie's ankles and sinking its teeth into her exhausted bones. She woke long before dawn, shivering beneath a thin wool blanket. For a moment her mind drifted, expecting the soft mattress and silk sheets of her Denver townhouse. Then her bruised shoulder throbbed, and the harsh reality of the Sterling Ranch crashed down upon her. There was no townhouse, there was no safety. There was only the freezing mountain air and the 1-week trial standing between her and a shallow grave in the snow. Evie forced herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest, aching from the brutal wagon ride and the near-death trek through the blizzard. She dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers clumsy and numb as she fastened the buttons of her plain cotton dress. Reaching into her canvas bag, she pulled out her mother's wooden spoon and the heavy cast-iron skillet. Her gaze lingered on the heavy clay-bottomed pot. She carefully placed it on the highest shelf in the pantry, hiding it behind a sack of dried beans. Whatever Arthur had died trying to protect, it would stay hidden until she figured out what it meant. Right now, her only priority was survival. She stepped into the cavernous, freezing kitchen. The hearth was a bed of dead gray ashes. Taking a deep breath, Evie set to work. She found kindling in a brass bucket and struck a match. The small flame flickered, fragile against the oppressive cold, before catching the dry pine. Slowly, the fire grew, casting dancing orange shadows against the log walls. Evie held her battered hands out to the warmth, closing her eyes as the agonizing numbness in her fingers began to melt into a sharp, stinging ache. Fire and ice, she thought. That's all this place is. By the time the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light over the jagged eastern peaks, the kitchen was transformed. The iron stove radiated a fierce, comforting heat. The smell of sizzling bacon grease, strong black coffee, and baking biscuits filled the air. Evie moved with a practiced rhythmic efficiency, her iron skillet a natural extension of her arm. The heavy oak door connecting the kitchen to the dining room swung open. The men shuffled in, bringing the smell of livestock, wet wool, and frost with them. There were 5 of them, moving with the stiff, exhausted gait of men who fought the land for a living. They stopped dead in their tracks at the threshold. Evie wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron and met their stares. At the head of the pack was an older man with a face like weathered leather and a thick, graying mustache that hid his mouth. His eyes, however, were entirely visible, sharp, calculating, and deeply suspicious. Beside him stood a boy no older than 17. His cheeks flushed from the cold, his eyes wide as he stared at the steaming platters of food on the table. "Morning," Evie said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "Breakfast is ready." The older man didn't move toward the table. He took off his battered Stetson, revealing a head of thinning gray hair, and looked from the biscuits to Evie, his expression hardening. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, gravelly bark. Before Evie could answer, heavy footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs. Wyatt Sterling descended into the dining room, looking every bit the ruthless mountain king in his dark denim and worn leather. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and his pale gray eyes swept over his men before settling on Evie. "She's the new cook," Wyatt said flatly, pulling out his chair at the head of the long table. "Her name is Mrs. Vance. She's on a 1-week trial. Sit down and eat, Hollis." Hollis, the grizzled foreman, clenched his jaw. He looked at Wyatt, then back to Evie, a profound hostility radiating from his rigid posture. "We don't need a city woman playing house up here, boss. This ain't a place for soft hands, and nobody cooks in that kitchen." The implication hung heavily in the air. Nobody cooks in Josie's kitchen. Wyatt's eyes darkened, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. "I said, sit down and eat." The command was absolute. Hollis shot Evie a venomous glare before taking his seat. The others followed suit, though the young boy, Toby, offered Evie a shy, grateful half-smile before piling his plate high with bacon and biscuits. Evie retreated to the kitchen, standing out of sight by the doorframe. She listened to the clatter of silverware and the low murmurs of the men. They were eating like starved wolves. She had won the first battle. She had filled their bellies. But she knew with a sinking certainty that Hollis would do everything in his power to run her off. She represented change, an intrusion into a grief they had all been harboring for 3 long years. The next 5 days were a relentless, grueling test of endurance. Wyatt had told her she was the cook, but on a working ranch, the cook was also the maid, the laundress, and the scullery maid. Evie quickly realized that if she wanted to secure her place, she had to prove she wasn't the fragile city widow they assumed she was. She woke every morning at 4. When the firewood ran low, Hollis conveniently forgot to have the men chop more. Evie didn't complain. She walked out into the freezing wind, picked up the heavy iron axe, and split the pine logs herself. The handle tore blisters into her palms, which popped and bled, stinging fiercely when she washed the dishes in boiling water. She wrapped her hands in torn strips of cotton and kept swinging. When the water pump froze solid, she hauled heavy iron buckets of snow to melt on the stove. She scrubbed the soot-stained floors until her knees ached. She mended Toby's torn winter coat, stitching the heavy canvas with quiet, precise movements late into the night by the light of a single kerosene lamp. And through it all, Wyatt watched her. He never offered to help. He never reprimanded Hollis for his petty tests, but Evie caught his gray eyes lingering on her when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched her bandaged hands as she served dinner. He watched the way she refused to lower her gaze when the men were gruff. He watched the firelight dance across her pale, exhausted face. Wyatt was ice, frozen in a perpetual winter of guilt, but he was slowly becoming mesmerized by the quiet, stubborn fire she brought into his home. By the afternoon of her 6th day, the snow had stopped, leaving the world buried under a glaring, pristine white blanket. Evie needed wild thyme and sage for a venison stew she was planning. The pantry was painfully bare of spices, but she had noticed dried stalks poking through the snowdrifts near the tree line behind the property. She wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders and waded out the back door, her boots crunching in the deep snow. The air was razor-sharp, burning her lungs with every breath, but the sheer, brutal beauty of the mountains offered a strange sort of peace. She was far away from Denver, far from Arthur's lies, far from Silas's cruelty. Evie kept her eyes on the ground, scraping away snow to uncover the hardy winter herbs. She wandered further than she intended, following a trail of dried sagebrush around a bend in the property line. She stopped abruptly. Before her lay a massive clearing, but the snow here was dirty, stained with a grayish-black soot that never seemed to wash away. Rising from the center of the clearing was the skeletal, charred remains of a massive barn. The massive timber beams were blackened and split, reaching up toward the sky like the twisted fingers of a corpse. The smell of old ash and scorched earth hung heavily in the stagnant air, completely overriding the scent of the pine trees. Evie stepped closer, inexplicably drawn to the ruin. The sheer violence of the destruction was palpable. This wasn't just a burned building. It was a monument to a tragedy. She reached out, her bandaged fingers brushing against a charred, splintered post. The wood crumbled under her touch, leaving a streak of black soot across her pale skin. "Get away from there!" The voice cracked like a rifle shot. Evie spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Wyatt was striding toward her through the snow, his face pale, his eyes wide and wild. The usual stoic, impenetrable mask was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral panic that made him look like a completely different man. "Wyatt, He grabbed her arm, his grip bruisingly tight, and yanked her violently away from the charred timber. He pulled her so hard she stumbled, falling against his broad chest. "I told you to stay near the house," Wyatt roared, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His eyes weren't looking at her. They were fixed on the burned ruins, his pupils dilated as if he were seeing flames that had died 3 years ago. "Don't you ever come out here. Never." Evie didn't shrink back. She felt the violent trembling in his powerful arms. This wasn't anger. It was terror. Absolute, paralyzing terror. "Wyatt," she said softly, keeping her voice incredibly calm. She didn't try to pull away from his grip. Instead, she raised her free hand and pressed it flat against the center of his chest. Beneath layers of wool and flannel, his heart was hammering against her palm like a trapped animal. "Look at me." He didn't move. His gray eyes were locked on the blackened beams. "Wyatt," she said again, a little firmer, her thumb brushing against the rough fabric of his coat. "Look at me. There's no fire. It's just snow. You're here." Slowly, agonizingly, Wyatt's gaze snapped down to hers. The wildness in his eyes flickered, colliding with the steady, calm amber of her gaze. He stared at her, his breathing loud in the absolute silence of the clearing. He looked down at her hand, still resting over his heart, and then at his own hand, which was gripping her arm like a vice. He released her instantly, stepping back as if her touch burned him. He dragged a shaky hand over his face, the stoic mask slamming back into place, though the cracks were now glaringly obvious. "There's nothing for you out here, Evie," he said, his voice dropping back to a gravelly, controlled rasp. It was the first time he had used her first name. "Go back to the kitchen." He turned and walked away, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind, a solitary figure carrying a weight too massive for one man to bear. Evie watched him go, the cold sinking into her bones. She looked back at the charred ruins, finally understanding the depth of the ice that had frozen Wyatt Sterling's soul. He wasn't just a grieving widower. He was a man punishing himself, standing in the ashes of his past, waiting to burn. Dawn broke over the Sterling ranch, not with the gentle light of the sun, but with the frantic, terrifying crack of a rifle. Evie jolted awake in her small pantry room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw off the blanket and rushed to the small, frost-rimmed window just in time to hear a man shouting, followed by the frenzied, high-pitched bleating of terrified calves. She threw her heavy shawl over her nightgown, shoved her bare feet into her boots, and ran through the kitchen to the back porch. The bitterly cold air hit her like a physical blow, but the scene unfolding near the winter pens froze the blood in her veins. A pack of timber wolves, massive, gaunt, and driven mad by the early winter famine, had breached the wooden fencing. There were at least 6 of them, gray shadows moving with lethal speed through the snow. Hollis and Toby were on the ridge, firing their Winchesters into the pack. A wolf dropped, but another lunged over the shattered fence line, sinking its teeth into the hind leg of a struggling calf. Wyatt was in the center of the chaos. He had no rifle, only a heavy iron pitchfork and a Colt revolver at his hip. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, firing 2 shots that dropped a wolf mid-leap. But as he turned to aim at another, a massive alpha male flanked him, launching itself from the roof of a low storage shed directly at his back. "Wyatt, behind you!" Evie screamed, her voice tearing through the frigid air. Wyatt spun, bringing his arm up just in time to protect his throat. The wolf's jaws clamped down brutally on his left forearm. The force of the impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent them both crashing into the snow. Evie grabbed the heavy wooden broom from the porch and sprinted into the snow, acting purely on adrenaline. By the time she reached the pen, a gunshot rang out. Wyatt had managed to press the barrel of his Colt against the wolf's ribs and pulled the trigger. The beast went limp, its massive weight collapsing on top of him. Hollis came running down the ridge, his face pale. "Boss, you hit?" Wyatt shoved the dead carcass off him with a grunt of pain. He climbed to his feet, his breath pluming in the air. The thick canvas and wool of his coat were shredded at the forearm, and dark, hot blood was already soaking through the fabric, dripping steadily onto the pristine white snow. "I'm fine," Wyatt gritted out, his jaw tight. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Evie, who was standing 10 feet away, clutching the broom like a weapon, her chest heaving. "What the hell are you doing out here? Get back in the house!" Evie didn't argue. She dropped the broom, turned on her heel, and ran back to the kitchen. She wasn't fleeing, she was preparing. By the time Wyatt walked through the back door 15 minutes later, kicking the snow from his boots, the kitchen was prepped. Evie had a large pot of water at a rolling boil on the stove. Clean, torn strips of white cotton were laid out on the wooden table, alongside a sharp paring knife and a bottle of cheap, potent whiskey she had found in the pantry. Hollis came in behind Wyatt, looking worried. "Let me saddle a horse, boss. Town doctor's a 4-hour ride if the snow holds off." "I'm not riding 4 hours for a dog bite, Hollis," Wyatt snapped, leaning heavily against the kitchen table. He was pale, his lips tight with suppressed pain. "Go check the perimeter. Make sure they didn't breach the north fence." "But your arm—" "I'll handle his arm," Evie interrupted, her voice brooked no argument, firm. She stepped up to the table, wiping her hands on her apron. "Go check the herd, Mr. Hollis. He won't bleed to death in my kitchen." Hollis hesitated, looking at Evie's determined amber eyes, then to Wyatt's stoic nod. Grumbling under his breath, the foreman turned and left, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The silence that fell over the kitchen was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the bubbling water. "Take the coat off," Evie ordered, pulling a wooden chair out for him. Wyatt looked at her, his jaw set stubbornly. "It's just a scratch." "There is blood dripping onto my clean floor," Evie replied flatly. "Take it off or I'll cut it off." A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of an amused smirk touched the corner of Wyatt's mouth. He awkwardly shrugged out of the heavy, ruined shearling coat, letting it drop to the floor. Beneath it, his flannel shirt was soaked crimson from the elbow down. Evie stepped close to him. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and unbuttoned the cuffs, helping him slide the ruined sleeve off his broad shoulders. Her knuckles brushed against the hard, warm planes of his chest, and she felt his muscles instinctively tense under her touch. When the wound was exposed, Evie drew a sharp breath. The wolf's teeth had torn deep into the thick muscle of his forearm. It wasn't fatal, but it was ugly, ragged, and dirty. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly. "I've had worse," Wyatt muttered, staring straight ahead. Evie poured a basin of hot water and began to carefully clean away the dried blood. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She stood standing right between his spread knees as he sat in the chair, her apron brushing against his thighs. She could smell the scent of pine, gunpowder, and sweat radiating from his skin. Beneath her fingertips, his skin was scorching hot, the pulse in his wrist beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her thumb. She picked up the bottle of whiskey. "Bite down on something." Wyatt just looked at her, his gray eyes darkening. "Pour it." Evie tipped the bottle, dousing the raw, open wounds with the harsh alcohol. Wyatt didn't make a sound. His jaw locked so tight the muscles leaped beneath his skin, and his free hand gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table until his knuckles turned white. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but Evie felt the violent shudder that ripped through his massive frame. She worked quickly, packing the wound with clean cotton and binding it tightly with the strips of fabric. Her movements were gentle, soothing, a stark contrast to the violence he was used to. As she tied off the bandage, she didn't step back immediately. She kept her hands resting lightly on his forearm, her thumb unconsciously tracing the edge of the clean white cotton. Wyatt looked down at her hands, then slowly raised his eyes to her face. She was so close he could see the faint smattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. "You didn't flinch out there," Wyatt said quietly, the gravel in his voice softer now. "When the wolf jumped, you didn't run away." "Running doesn't stop the wolves from coming," Evie said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her gaze locking with his. "It just means you die tired." A heavy, charged silence stretched between them. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly too thick to breathe. Wyatt shifted, his gaze dropping momentarily to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. He was a man starved for warmth, and she was standing practically in his arms. "I wasn't fast enough," Wyatt said suddenly, the confession tearing out of his throat before he could stop it. The words belonged to the ruined barn, to the terror of yesterday, not to the wolf attack. Evie's breath hitched. She knew what he was talking about. "The fire," Wyatt continued, his voice hollow, his eyes looking through her into a past she couldn't see. "Lightning hit the roof. Dry hay. It went up like a matchbox. Josie was inside checking a lame mare. I was in the house. By the time I heard her screaming, by the time I got to the doors, the roof collapsed." He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. "I tried to dig through the burning beams with my bare hands. Hollis had to knock me out with the butt of his rifle to stop me from burning alive with her." He looked at Evie, his gray eyes shattered, laying his soul bare in a way he hadn't done for 3 years. "I wasn't fast enough. If I had been out there with her, if I had been a better man." Evie felt a profound, aching sorrow for him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault because guilt didn't listen to logic. Instead, she slid her hands up from his wrist, resting her palms gently against his rough, unshaven cheeks. Wyatt froze, his breath catching in his throat at the shocking, tender intimacy of her touch. "You are a good man, Wyatt Sterling," Evie whispered fiercely, forcing him to hold her gaze. "But carrying the dead will only crush the living. You survived. You have men who rely on you. You have a ranch to protect. You cannot change the past, no matter how much you punish yourself. But you can choose what you do with tomorrow." He stared at her, the warmth of her palms seeping through the ice that had encased his heart for so long. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his uninjured hand and placed it over hers, holding her palm against his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch for one long, desperate heartbeat. Then, as quickly as the vulnerability had appeared, he opened his eyes, gently pulling her hands away. He stood up, clearing his throat, his stoic mask slipping back into place, though it didn't fit quite as tightly as before. "Breakfast is going to burn," he muttered, turning his back to her to grab his ruined coat. Evie let out a shaky breath, stepping back to the stove. The ice hadn't melted entirely, but it had cracked. 4 days later, the dynamic on the Sterling Ranch had subtly shifted. Hollis was still gruff, but he had stopped hiding the firewood. The trial week was over, and Wyatt hadn't mentioned sending her away. The unspoken agreement was that Evie was staying. Late in the afternoon, Evie was on the back porch, peeling potatoes into a bucket, when Wyatt walked out of the barn. He carried a heavy Winchester rifle in one hand and a box of ammunition in the other. He didn't walk past her into the house. He stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. "Put the knife down," Wyatt said. Evie wiped her hands on her apron. "Dinner won't cook itself. It can wait 10 minutes. He gestured with his chin toward the open snowfield behind the house. "If you're going to stay on this mountain, you need to know how to kill what comes to the door." "I won't always be here to shoot the wolves." Evie swallowed hard. The memory of Silas's thugs in the alleyway flashed in her mind. A skillet was a good weapon in close quarters, but Silas would bring men with guns. If she wanted to survive, she needed to learn. She walked down the steps, stepping into the snow beside him. Wyatt led her to a makeshift target, a line of empty tin cans sitting on a wooden fence rail 50 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was incredibly heavy, the cold steel biting into her bare hands. "Snug the stock tight into your shoulder, or the recoil will bruise you to the bone," Wyatt instructed, his tone purely business. Evie tried to lift the rifle, but her stance was awkward, the heavy barrel dipping toward the ground. Wyatt sighed softly. He stepped up directly behind her. Evie gasped softly as the solid wall of his broad chest pressed against her back. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, shielding her from the bitter wind. He reached around her, his large hands covering hers on the rifle. "Relax your arms," his deep voice rumbled right next to her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're too stiff. Let the gun do the work." He adjusted her grip, his calloused fingers sliding over her knuckles, repositioning her left hand further up the barrel. He nudged her right foot with his boot, widening her stance for balance. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She was entirely enveloped by him, the smell of leather, pine, and masculine musk filling her senses. "Look down the sights," Wyatt murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "Line the front post up in the center of the rear notch. Put it dead center on the can." Evie tried to focus, but her heart was beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Take a breath," he instructed gently, his thumb brushing against hers on the trigger guard. "Let half of it out. Hold it, squeeze the trigger, don't pull." "Just squeeze." Evie held her breath. She squeezed. The rifle roared, bucking violently against her shoulder. If Wyatt hadn't been standing right behind her, bracing her body with his own, she would have been knocked off her feet. 50 yards away, a tin can flew violently off the fence post, spinning into the snow. "I hit it," Evie breathed, lowering the rifle, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden fierce surge of adrenaline. "I actually hit it." Wyatt stepped back, the sudden loss of his body heat leaving her feeling strangely exposed. He looked at the fallen can, then down at the fierce, triumphant glow in her amber eyes. The corners of his mouth lifted into a genuine, albeit small, smile. "Not bad, widow," Wyatt said softly. "Not bad at all." He turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving Evie standing in the snow, her shoulder aching, her hands trembling, and a fire burning bright and hot in the center of her chest. The mountains were brutal. Silas Vance was coming, and her past was a nightmare. But as she watched Wyatt's broad back disappear into the shadows, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to stay and fight. The illusion of safety is a fragile, dangerous thing. For 3 weeks, Evie Vance had allowed herself to believe she had outrun her demons. The brutal rhythm of the Sterling Ranch had become a strange sort of sanctuary. Her hands were calloused, her knuckles permanently scarred by the freezing water and the iron stove, but the constant gnawing terror that had chased her out of Denver had begun to fade into the background. She was standing at the heavy oak table, the sleeves of her cotton dress rolled past her elbows, rhythmically kneading a massive mound of sourdough. The kitchen was suffocatingly warm, smelling of yeast and roasted chicory. Outside, the midday sun reflected blindingly off the snowdrifts. Then the dog barked. Not the lazy warning woof that greeted the ranch hands, but a vicious, frantic snarling. Evie paused, her hands sinking into the dough. She wiped a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist and walked to the frost-rimmed window, scrubbing a small circle of clarity into the glass. Her heart simply stopped. Riding through the heavy timber gates of the Sterling Ranch were 8 men. 7 of them were hard-eyed hired guns, armed to the teeth, sitting atop thick-chested quarter horses. But the man leading them rode a magnificent purebred black stallion. He wore a tailored wool suit beneath an expensive fur-lined coat, a silver-banded bowler hat sitting perfectly on his head. He looked entirely out of place against the raw, jagged backdrop of the Colorado mountains, like a polished razor blade dropped into the dirt. Silas Vance. The blood drained from Evie's face, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. No, God, no. How did he find me? She backed away from the window, her flour-covered hands trembling so violently she knocked a tin cup off the counter. It hit the floorboards with a sharp clatter. She scrambled backward, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the pantry, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Outside, the heavy thud of boots sounded on the porch steps. Wyatt had emerged from the barn, his Winchester rifle resting casually but dangerously across his forearm. Hollis stepped out of the bunkhouse, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, flanked by Toby and the rest of the ranch hands. The air in the courtyard instantly thickened, the tension pulling as tight as a hangman's knot. "That's far enough," Wyatt's gravelly voice cut through the crisp mountain air, carrying easily through the thin walls of the cabin. "You're trespassing on Sterling land." Silas pulled his stallion to a halt. He looked down at Wyatt with a predatory, condescending smile. He pulled a silver cigar case from his coat pocket, taking his time to select one before lighting it. The sweet, cloying smell of imported tobacco wafted toward the porch, entirely foreign in the scent of pine and horse sweat. "Wyatt Sterling, I presume," Silas said, his voice smooth, cultured, and utterly venomous. "I am Silas Vance, and while I appreciate the welcoming committee, I'm afraid you are mistaken. As of yesterday afternoon, I own the paper on this land." Evie squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her knuckles against her mouth to stifle a sob. "You're a liar," Wyatt said flatly, though his grip on the Winchester tightened. "My mortgage is held by the First National Bank in Denver." "Was," Silas corrected, blowing a stream of gray smoke into the freezing air. "I acquired a controlling interest in First National last week. Imagine my surprise when I was reviewing the accounts and saw the Sterling Ranch. 3 years of missed payments. A mountain of debt. The bank was ready to foreclose a year ago, but the previous manager had a soft spot for your tragic circumstances." Silas offered a mock-sympathetic frown. "I, however, do not run a charity." Wyatt's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against his collar. "The note isn't due for another 30 days. "Legally, yes," Silas conceded smoothly. "You have 30 days to produce the balance in full. $8,000. A sum I know for a fact you do not have, considering you're feeding your men beans and shooting wolves off your dying calves." Silas leaned forward in his saddle, his dark eyes narrowing into obsidian slits. "But I didn't ride all the way up this God-forsaken mountain for dirt and cattle, Mr. Sterling. I came for what's mine." "I don't have anything of yours." "You have my sister-in-law," Silas said softly. The words hit the cabin walls like bullets. "Evelyn Vance. She stole something from me when my brother died, a piece of family property. I know she's here. Hand the widow over to me right now, along with whatever she brought with her, and I will tear up the mortgage right here on your steps. The ranch is yours, free and clear. Keep the woman, and I will take this land, your cattle, and this house in exactly 30 days. I will leave you with nothing." In the pantry, Evie slid down the wall until she hit the floor. It was over. Silas had outmaneuvered her. $8,000 was an impossible fortune. Wyatt had nearly killed himself trying to keep this ranch alive for 3 years. He loved this land more than he loved his own life. Why would he ever sacrifice his legacy, his home, and the memory of his dead wife for a stray cook he had known for barely a month? Outside, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Wyatt stared at the man on the black horse. He looked at the armed thugs flanking him. Then, with deliberate, terrifying slowness, Wyatt racked the lever of his Winchester. The metallic clack-clack echoed like a cannon shot across the snowy courtyard. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get your horse off my property," Wyatt growled, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a pure, localized violence. "Before I blow you out of that expensive saddle." Silas's smug smile faltered. His eyes darkened with genuine fury. "You're a fool, Sterling. A dead, bankrupt fool. You have 30 days." Silas yanked his horse's reins, turning the stallion sharply. "Let's go, boys. The mountain will freeze them out before the month is up anyway." Evie listened to the sound of the horses riding away, the crunch of snow slowly fading into the distance. The heavy front door of the cabin crashed open. Wyatt marched into the kitchen, his boots striking the floorboards like hammer blows. He looked massive, terrifying, his gray eyes burning with a cold, contained inferno. He saw the knocked-over tin cup, the abandoned dough, and finally spotted Evie huddled in the shadows of the pantry. "Get up," he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Evie scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling so badly she had to lean against the doorframe. She looked at him, her amber eyes wide and bright with unshed tears. "Silas Vance," Wyatt said the name like it was a curse. "You want to tell me why a Denver railroad tycoon just threatened to rip my ranch out from under me over a cook?" "Wyatt, I swear to God, I didn't know he bought the bank," Evie pleaded, her voice shaking. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach. "Arthur, my husband, he was Silas's accountant. When Arthur died, Silas came for everything. He took my house, my clothes, my money. He said Arthur owed him. But it wasn't enough. He was looking for something. I didn't know what it was. I still don't, I swear it. I just ran." Wyatt stepped closer, towering over her. "He said you stole something." "I took a skillet, a wooden spoon, and a cracked pot," Evie cried out, a hysterical edge bleeding into her voice. She gestured wildly to the heavy canvas bag sitting in the corner of her room. "That's it. That's all I have left in the entire world. I have no money. I have no stolen property. He's a monster, Wyatt. He just wants to destroy me because Arthur humiliated him. I didn't mean to bring him to your door." Wyatt stared down at her. He studied the raw panic in her eyes, the trembling of her exhausted frame. For a man who had been betrayed by fate, he had a profound ability to recognize a lie. And he knew, looking at her, that she was telling the absolute truth. She was just as much a victim of the storm as he was. But the reality of the situation remained. $8,000, 30 days. Wyatt turned away from her, dragging a rough hand through his dark hair, a bitter curse tearing from his lips. He paced across the kitchen, his mind working furiously. Evie watched him, the crushing weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. She had ruined him. This man who had pulled her from the snow, who had given her a hearth and a home, was going to lose everything because of her. She swallowed the lump of ash in her throat. Her spine straightened. She walked into the pantry and picked up her canvas bag. She shoved her extra apron inside, followed by her mother's wooden spoon and the cast-iron skillet. Wyatt stopped pacing. He turned, his brow furrowing, as he watched her step back into the kitchen, the heavy bag slung over her shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm leaving. Evie said, her voice completely hollow, stripped of all emotion. She couldn't look him in the eye, focusing instead on the top button of his flannel shirt. If I walked down to the settlement and turned myself over to him, he said he would tear up the mortgage. He'll leave the ranch alone. She took a step toward the back door. "Stop right there," Wyatt commanded. "Wyatt, please," Evie whispered, a single tear escaping, cutting a hot trail through the flour dust on her cheek. "This is your legacy. This is Josie's legacy. I am not going to be the reason you lose it. I've survived Silas before. I'll survive him again." She reached for the brass handle of the door. In 2 massive strides, Wyatt crossed the kitchen. He didn't grab her arm. He reached past her, slamming his large, calloused hand flat against the heavy oak door, holding it shut with immovable force. Evie gasped, trapped between the solid wood of the door and the imposing, heat-radiating wall of his chest. She slowly tilted her head up. Wyatt was staring down at her, his gray eyes no longer cold, but burning with a fierce, possessive fury that stole the breath straight from her lungs. "Do you think I'm a coward?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that she felt in her own chest. "No," Evie breathed. "Of course not. Do you think I would hand a woman over to a slaughterhouse just to save my own skin?" "It's your home, Wyatt." "You're right. It is my home." Wyatt shifted, his body pressing just a fraction of an inch closer, completely boxing her in. "And you are my cook. You are a part of the Sterling Ranch now." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the folded legal notice Silas had tossed onto the porch, the 30-day foreclosure warning. Without breaking eye contact with Evie, Wyatt crumpled the heavy parchment in his fist. He turned his head and casually tossed the balled-up paper straight into the roaring hearth fire. The flames eagerly devoured it, turning Silas Vance's threat into black floating ash. "Nobody touches what's mine," Wyatt growled softly, the words a fierce, unbreakable vow. He reached up, his rough thumb gently brushing the tear from her cheek, the contrast of his calloused skin against her soft face sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Unpack your bag, Evie. We have 30 days to raise $8,000, and I intend to make Silas Vance choke on it." The Sterling Ranch went to war. There were no bullets fired, no trenches dug, but the atmosphere was thick with the frantic, desperate energy of a besieged fortress. The only way to raise $8,000 in 30 days was to execute a nearly impossible early spring cattle drive. They couldn't sell locally. Silas owned the buyers in Oak Haven. They had to drive 1,000 head of cattle through the treacherous, half-frozen mountain passes to a railhead in Cheyenne, Wyoming, 200 miles away. Wyatt drove his men mercilessly, and he drove himself harder. But to Evie's profound surprise, the men didn't complain. The threat of Silas Vance had galvanized them. Even Hollis, who had spent the last month glaring at Evie, found her in the kitchen the morning after Silas's visit. The old foreman dumped a massive sack of flour onto the counter, his jaw set. "Sterling men don't back down to city suits," Hollis grumbled, not meeting her eyes. "And we don't hand over our own. You pack enough trail rations to get us to Cheyenne, widow. We'll handle the rest." It was the closest thing to an acceptance she was ever going to get, and Evie had to blink back tears as she nodded. For the next 2 weeks, Evie and Wyatt worked in perfect, unspoken synchronization. The barriers of formality and grief that had kept them at arm's length were pulverized under the sheer weight of their shared goal. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them. A hot cup of coffee waiting when he stomped in at midnight. Dry bandages for the healing wolf bite on his arm. A quiet presence when the stress threatened to crack his stoic facade. On the 15th day, the weather broke, offering a brief, fragile glimpse of spring. The sun was shockingly warm, turning the snowdrifts into rushing streams of icy water. Evie was carrying a heavy basket of wet laundry toward the clotheslines when Wyatt intercepted her. He took the basket from her hands, effortlessly balancing it on his hip. "Leave the laundry," Wyatt said. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes dark and bruised, but there was a distinct, vibrant energy thrumming beneath his skin. "You need a break. Come to the corral." Evie wiped her brow, confused. "Wyatt, I have 3 dozen biscuits to bake for the trail reserves." "The biscuits can wait. I told you I'd teach you to shoot. Now I'm teaching you to ride." 10 minutes later, Evie found herself standing nervously beside a beautiful, gentle-eyed roan mare. She was wearing a pair of Wyatt's old denim trousers, rolled up at the cuffs, and one of his oversized flannel shirts. She felt utterly ridiculous, but Wyatt looked at her like she was the most natural thing in the world. "Her name is Penny," Wyatt said, running a soothing hand down the mare's neck. "She's steady. Won't spook at a gunshot, won't buck if you lose your balance. Put your left foot in the stirrup. Grab the saddle horn." Evie hesitated. "I really don't think this is a good idea. I'm a city girl, Wyatt. The only horses I've ever seen were pulling carriages." "You're a Sterling Ranch girl now," Wyatt corrected smoothly, moving to stand right behind her. "Up you go." With a deep breath, Evie hoisted herself up. She lacked grace, nearly swinging completely over the other side, but Wyatt was there. His large hands clamped firmly onto her waist, steadying her, guiding her gently down into the leather saddle. The heat of his touch burned through the thick flannel, sending a jolt of pure electricity straight to her core. "There you go," he murmured, looking up at her. He didn't step back immediately. His hands remained resting lightly on her hips, his thumbs brushing the fabric of her trousers. "Keep your heels down. Keep your back straight, but let your hips move with her. If you fight the horse, she'll fight you." For the next hour, Wyatt led Penny around the muddy corral. Evie's initial terror slowly evaporated, replaced by a thrilling sense of freedom. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the warm sun on her face, the quiet, encouraging rumble of Wyatt's voice. It was intoxicating. For a brief, fleeting moment, she wasn't a hunted woman. She was just a woman, alive and breathing in the mountains. When it was time to dismount, Wyatt stepped close to the horse. "Kick your feet out of the stirrups. Slide down. I've got you." Evie swung her leg over, letting herself slide down the smooth leather saddle. But her legs were like jelly from gripping the horse's barrel, and her boots slipped in the mud the moment she hit the ground. She pitched forward with a gasp. Wyatt caught her instantly. His arms locked around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest to keep them both from falling into the mud. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Suddenly, the world narrowed down to the space between them. Evie's hands were splayed flat against the hard, muscular plane of his chest. Wyatt's arms were wrapped tightly around her back, holding her so close she could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart. She looked up. His face was mere inches from hers. The gray eyes that had once looked so dead, so calcified by grief, were currently blazing with a dark, intense hunger that made her mouth go completely dry. He looked at her lips. The air around them seemed to crackle, pulling taut like a drawn bowstring. Evie's breath hitched. She leaned in, just a fraction of an inch, guided by a gravity she couldn't fight. "Boss," Toby's voice rang out from the barn door. "Hollis needs you to look at the wagon axle." Wyatt froze. The spell shattered. He exhaled a harsh, jagged breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. Slowly, agonizingly, he stepped back, dropping his arms from her waist. He didn't say a word, but his eyes lingered on her face for a second too long before he turned and strode toward the barn, leaving Evie standing in the mud, her entire body trembling with a sudden, overwhelming need. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Tomorrow, the men would ride out with the herd. Wyatt would be gone for weeks. He was riding into brutal terrain, facing unpredictable weather, rustlers, and whatever sabotage Silas Vance might have planned. The thought of the ranch without him, the thought of her life without him, settled in Evie's chest like a block of lead. The cabin was silent, the men snoring heavily in the bunkhouse. Evie threw a thick wool blanket over her shoulders and stepped out onto the back porch. The mountain air was brutally cold, stinging her cheeks, but the sky was a masterpiece. 1,000,000 diamond-hard stars burned fiercely against the pitch-black canvas of the night, uncaring and magnificent. She leaned against the wooden railing, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should be asleep." Evie turned. Wyatt was sitting in the shadows of the far corner of the porch, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't wearing his coat, just his dark Henley shirt, the sleeves pushed up to reveal his thick, scarred forearms. "So should you," Evie replied softly. She didn't go back inside. She walked over and leaned against the railing near him, the silence stretching comfortably between them. "I leave at first light," Wyatt said, staring out at the dark, jagged outline of the mountains. "Hollis is staying behind with 2 men. They have orders. If Silas shows his face, they are to shoot his horse out from under him. And if I don't make it back in time, so if the herd doesn't sell—" "Don't," Evie interrupted, her voice tight. "Don't talk like that. You will make it back. You have to." Wyatt set his glass down on the wooden floorboards. He stood up, stepping out of the shadows. The moonlight caught the hard, weary angles of his face. He walked toward her, stopping only when the toes of his boots bumped against hers. "3 years ago, I didn't care if I lived or died on this mountain," Wyatt said, his voice a raw, jagged whisper that seemed to scrape against the silence of the night. "I was just waiting for the cold to finish me off. I fought for this ranch because it was all I had left of her. It was a grave." He reached out. His large, rough hand gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch incredibly gentle for a man built for violence. "But you brought the fire back, Evie," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You walked out of a blizzard and brought my home back to life. I'm not fighting for a grave anymore. I'm fighting for a future." Evie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She looked up into his eyes, seeing the profound, terrifying vulnerability hiding behind the steel. "Wyatt, if I leave tomorrow without doing this," he whispered, his face descending toward hers, "I think I might lose my mind." He didn't wait for permission. He didn't hesitate. Wyatt's mouth crashed down onto hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It was not a sweet, hesitant exploration. It was a collision, a desperate, raw, visceral claiming born of months of suppressed terror, grief, and undeniable, overwhelming need. Evie gasped against his lips, and that was all the invitation he needed. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her completely flush against his massive frame, crushing the wool blanket between them. Evie's hands flew up, tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring all her fear, all her gratitude, and all the desperate, aching loneliness of her past into the kiss. He tasted like expensive whiskey, black coffee, and pure, intoxicating heat. Wyatt groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated deep in his chest. He backed her up against the log wall of the cabin, pinning her there with the solid weight of his body. One of his hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss, while his other hand gripped her waist so tightly it bruised, as if he were afraid she would dissolve into the night air if he let go. They kissed like starving people, like 2 shattered survivors desperately trying to fuse their broken pieces together. It was messy, breathless, and utterly consuming. When Wyatt finally tore his mouth away, they were both gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed tightly, his chest heaving against hers. His hand was still tangled in her hair, his thumb stroking her cheek with a trembling tenderness. "I will come back," Wyatt vowed fiercely, his breath hot against her swollen lips. "I will bring the money. I will bury Silas Vance, and I will come back to you. Do you hear me?" Evie opened her eyes, tears spilling over her lashes, hot and fast. She wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, holding on to the only real thing she had ever known. "I hear you," she whispered into the dark. "I'll be waiting." The fragile truce between them had shattered, replaced by a bond forged in fire and sealed in the dark. The stakes had never been higher. Because now, if Silas Vance won, Evie wouldn't just lose her life. She would lose her heart. Dawn bled over the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies. painting the snow-heavy pines in shades of bruised purple and dull gold. The air was brutally cold, the kind of freezing temperature that snapped branches and froze breath to a man's collar. In the courtyard of the Sterling Ranch, the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, desperate energy. The cattle drive was leaving. Men shouted over the lowing of the restless herd, leather harnesses creaked, and the heavy breath of the horses plumed in the freezing air. Inside the cabin, Evie moved through the kitchen like a woman possessed. She hadn't slept a wink since Wyatt had kissed her on the dark porch. Her lips still felt bruised, her skin still humming with the phantom heat of his touch. He was leaving. He was riding into 200 miles of brutal terrain to save a ranch that had become her sanctuary, all because she had inadvertently brought the devil to his doorstep. She scrubbed her flour-dusted hands on her apron and turned to the pantry. She needed to pack the last of the salt pork and the heavy reserve of hardtack she had baked the night before. Her eyes landed on the top shelf. Sitting there, shoved behind a sack of dried pinto beans, was the clay-bottomed pot she had dragged all the way from Denver. Arthur's frantic, fever-soaked voice echoed in the quiet of the pantry. "Don't let Silas take the cracked pot, Evie. Whatever you do, keep it safe." Evie stared at it. For a month she had been too exhausted, too terrified, and too focused on survival to question it. Why would Arthur care about a cheap cracked pot, while he was dying of fever and drowning in debt? Silas had seized their home, their bank accounts, the silver, the furniture. Why had Silas been so furious that she had escaped with kitchen scraps? She reached up, her hands still slick with butter and flour from the morning's baking. She grabbed the thick ceramic handles of the pot and pulled it down. It was unnaturally heavy. She had always attributed the weight to the thick clay base designed to retain heat on a stove, but holding it now with clear eyes and a suspicious mind, the weight felt wrong, uneven. Evie adjusted her grip, turning toward the kitchen table, but her hands were slick. The heavy pot shifted, slipping through her greasy fingers. She gasped, lunging to catch it, but it was too late. The pot hit the solid stone edge of the hearth with a deafening, catastrophic crash. Soot and ash plumed into the air. Evie froze, staring at the shattered ceramic and clay scattered across the floorboards. But it wasn't just clay. Lying in the center of the debris, gleaming dully in the firelight, was a sealed, cylindrical copper tube. It was about the length of a man's hand, capped tightly with a wax-sealed brass screw. The heavy front door of the cabin swung open. Wyatt strode into the kitchen, his heavy shearling coat dusted with snow, his Winchester rifle gripped in one hand. He had heard the crash from the porch. His gray eyes instantly locked onto Evie, checking her for injuries before dropping to the shattered mess on the floor. "Evie!" Wyatt's voice was tense. "What happened?" Evie couldn't speak. She slowly dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp shards of clay biting through the fabric of her dress. She reached into the ashes with trembling hands and picked up the heavy copper tube. "He didn't want the house," she whispered, her voice trembling with a horrifying realization. "Silas didn't care about the mortgage. He didn't care about Arthur's debts." Wyatt stepped forward, the snow melting off his boots. He knelt beside her, his massive frame dwarfing hers. He took the copper tube from her shaking hands. Pulling a hunting knife from his belt, he sliced through the thick wax seal and wedged the blade under the brass cap, popping it free. He tipped the tube. A tightly rolled bundle of thick parchment paper slid out into his calloused palm. Wyatt unrolled the documents, his eyes scanning the dense, meticulous handwriting. It was a ledger. Columns of dates, massive sums of money, and names. Railroad commissioners, federal judges, mayors. Beside each name was a detailed account of bribes paid, land deeds forged, and in 3 chilling instances, orders for the violent removal of competing landowners. "It's a death warrant," Wyatt murmured, the gravel in his voice completely stripped of its usual stoicism. He looked up at Evie, his eyes wide with the magnitude of what they were holding. "Evie, this is a ledger of every bribe, every extortion, and every drop of blood Silas Vance has spilled to build his railroad empire. This is federal prison. He'd hang for this." Evie pressed her hands to her mouth, her stomach violently overturning. Arthur hadn't been protecting her. He had used her as a blind mule to smuggle his insurance policy out of Denver. He had put a target on her back, knowing Silas would hunt her to the ends of the earth to retrieve this tube. "We don't need to drive the cattle," Wyatt said, a fierce predatory light igniting in his gray eyes. He stood up, pulling Evie with him. "We don't need $8,000. We take this ledger to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. There's a standing bounty on Silas Vance for railroad fraud, but they've never had the proof. This is the proof. The bounty alone will pay off the ranch twice over, and Silas will rot in a federal cell." A wave of dizzying, intoxicating relief washed over Evie. She threw her arms around Wyatt's neck, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, his hand burying in her hair. It was over. They had the upper hand. They had won. Bang! The sharp, echoing crack of a gunshot ripped through the morning air, coming from the eastern ridge. Wyatt released her instantly, his body snapping into lethal focus. He grabbed his Winchester, racking the lever as he sprinted for the front door. Evie was right behind him. Out in the courtyard, the ranch hands had drawn their weapons, peering through the heavy morning mist toward the tree line. The air was deathly silent, the gunshots still echoing off the jagged peaks. Then a horse emerged from the pines. It was a beautiful, nervous bay gelding, its reins dragging in the snow. It trotted slowly down the slope toward the gates. But the saddle was empty. "That's Toby's mount," Hollis said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, terrified whisper. The old foreman lowered his rifle, his face draining of all color. "The boy was riding the perimeter, checking the fence line before we moved the herd." Wyatt didn't wait. He vaulted over the porch railing, his boots hitting the snow as he ran toward the nervous horse. He grabbed the dragging reins, steadying the animal. Pinned to the leather saddle horn with a jagged hunting knife was a piece of expensive cream-colored parchment. Wyatt ripped the knife free and unfolded the paper. Evie reached his side just as his gray eyes scanned the elegant cursive handwriting. The blood drained from Wyatt's face, leaving him looking like a statue carved from ice. He handed the note to Evie. Her hands shook violently as she read the words. "Mr. Sterling, it seems we both have something the other desires. The boy is unharmed, for now. Bring the widow and the item she stole to the southern property line at midnight. Do not bring your men. Do not bring the herd. If you fail to appear, or if you involve the law, I will burn the boy alive and leave his ashes on your doorstep. The choice is yours. S. Vance." Evie's vision tunneled. The crisp mountain air suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. Silas didn't want the ranch. He knew they had the ledger, and he had taken the youngest, most innocent member of their crew to force their hand. Toby, who had smiled at her on her first morning here. Toby, who ate her biscuits with infectious enthusiasm. "He's going to kill him," Evie whispered, the paper crinkling in her grip. "Even if we give him the ledger." "Silas doesn't leave loose ends. He'll kill Toby, he'll kill me, and he'll kill you." "Saddle the horses!" Wyatt roared, turning back to Hollis and the men. The paralyzing ice was gone, replaced by a volcanic, terrifying fury. "Break out the extra ammunition. Every man mounts up, now." "Wyatt, the note says no men." Evie grabbed his arm, her amber eyes wide with panic. "If he sees an army riding up, he'll execute Toby on the spot." Wyatt stopped. He looked down at her hand gripping his sleeve, then up to her terrified face. His chest heaved, his jaw locking so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. He was a man backed into a corner, forced to choose between the woman he loved, the boy he had sworn to protect, and the legacy he was fighting to save. "I am not trading you for the boy, Evie," Wyatt said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "And I am not letting Silas Vance burn one of my own." He looked toward the darkening southern ridge, the gray clouds rolling in over the peaks, promising violence. "We don't wait for midnight," Wyatt said, his grip tightening on his Winchester. "Silas thinks he holds all the cards, but he doesn't know this mountain, and he doesn't know me." The night was pitch black, a suffocating blanket of darkness untouched by moonlight. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyons like a choir of the damned, rattling the window panes of the Sterling cabin. Wyatt, Hollis, and the remaining men had spent the hours since noon preparing a deadly trap at the southern property line. They had rigged the terrain, positioning themselves to ambush Silas's men the moment they arrived for the midnight exchange. Evie had been ordered to stay in the cabin, armed with Wyatt's revolver and the iron skillet, barred behind the heavy oak doors. But Silas Vance was not a man who played by the rules of civilized warfare. He had no intention of waiting for a midnight duel in the snow. At 10 p.m., Evie sat by the dying hearth fire in the parlor, the heavy copper tube resting on her lap, the cold steel of the revolver heavy in her hand. The silence of the cabin was agonizing. Then she smelled it. Acrid, sharp, the unmistakable scent of sulfur and burning pine. Before she could process the smell, a sudden blinding flash of orange light erupted through the frosted window panes. A deafening whoosh ripped through the night, followed instantly by the frantic, terrified screams of horses. Evie leaped to her feet, dropping the tube to the rug. She rushed to the window. The new barn, the massive timber structure Wyatt had spent the last 2 years painstakingly rebuilding, was engulfed in a roaring inferno. Flames licked 70 feet into the pitch-black sky, eating through the dry wood and winter hay with a ferocious, starving hunger. Silas hadn't waited at the property line. He had flanked them in the dark and brought the war directly to their doorstep. "Wyatt!" Evie screamed, knowing he was miles away at the southern ridge. But Wyatt wasn't miles away. From the shadows of the tree line, Wyatt and Hollis emerged, riding their mounts into the ground. They had realized the trap was empty and sprinted back just as the first torch was thrown. Wyatt threw himself from his horse before it had even fully stopped. He hit the snow running, his Winchester raised. But as he cleared the courtyard and the full blinding magnitude of the burning barn hit him, something inside him simply snapped. The heat washed over his face, blisteringly hot. The roar of the flames drowned out the howling wind. The terrified, high-pitched shrieking of the trapped horses echoed in the canyon. It was happening again. The year wasn't 1888. It was 1885. Josie was inside. Josie was screaming his name. The roof was caving in. He couldn't breathe. The smoke was suffocating him. He wasn't fast enough. He was failing her again. Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks, 50 yards from the blazing structure. The Winchester slipped from his grip, landing silently in the snow. His knees buckled slightly, his arms hanging limp at his sides. His gray eyes dilated, reflecting the towering flames, utterly blind to the present moment. He was paralyzed. A ghost trapped in the ashes of his own mind. "Boss, move!" Hollis roared, firing his Colt into the dark as Silas's hired guns emerged from the shadows of the outbuildings. Wyatt didn't blink. He didn't flinch as a bullet whizzed past his ear, embedding itself into the porch pillar. He was entirely, fundamentally broken. Inside the cabin, Evie saw Wyatt freeze. She saw the absolute terror in his rigid posture. She knew exactly what was happening. Silas had inadvertently triggered the deepest, most agonizing trauma in Wyatt's soul. Evie didn't think. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the kitchen counter, the only weapon she truly knew how to wield, threw the heavy bolt on the front door, and ran out onto the porch into the blinding heat of the fire. "Wyatt!" she screamed, sprinting down the wooden steps. From the shadows beneath the porch, a figure lunged. A gloved hand twisted violently into Evie's hair, jerking her backward so hard her boots left the snow. She cried out in pain as she was thrown roughly to the ground. Standing over her, his tailored coat reflecting the orange glow of the burning barn, was Silas Vance. He held a silver-plated revolver in one hand, while his other hand gripped the collar of a bloodied, bruised Toby, pressing the barrel of the gun to the boy's temple. "Well, well," Silas purred, his cultured voice easily carrying over the roar of the fire. He smiled down at Evie, his eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "You always were a remarkably stubborn woman, Evelyn. Bring me the ledger or I blow the boy's brains out right here." Evie gasped for breath, the snow freezing against her back. She looked wildly toward the courtyard. Wyatt was still standing there 10 yards away, staring blankly at the burning barn, completely lost in his night terror. "Look at him," Silas sneered, kicking Evie sharply in the ribs. She curled inward with a groan. "Your great mountain protector. He's nothing but a broken coward. He's going to stand there and watch you die, just like he watched his wife burn." Silas reached down, grabbing Evie by the front of her dress, hauling her up to her knees. He pressed the cold steel of his revolver against her cheek. "The ledger, Evie. Now." This was the moment Evie was supposed to scream. She was supposed to beg for Wyatt to save her, to play the helpless victim she had been for so many years in Denver. But Evie Vance was done being a victim. She looked past Silas's immaculate suit. She looked at Wyatt, trapped in the invisible flames of his past, and she knew that words wouldn't reach him. Evie didn't scream for help. Her hand, buried in the snow beside her, closed tightly around the heavy, cold handle of her mother's cast-iron skillet. With a primal, guttural roar born of absolute fury, Evie twisted her body. She swung the 10-pound iron pan in a vicious, blinding arc. Clang! The sharp, deafening metallic ring of solid iron striking bones sliced through the roar of the fire like a thunderclap. The skillet connected squarely with Silas Vance's jaw. The impact was devastating. Silas's head snapped violently to the side. Blood and teeth sprayed into the snow. He dropped his revolver, a strangled, wet gargle escaping his throat as his legs folded underneath him. He hit the ground hard, writhing in the snow, his jaw utterly shattered. Toby scrambled away, gasping for air. Evie stood up, her chest heaving, the heavy iron skillet still raised, her amber eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying light. That metallic clang, the sudden cessation of Silas's voice and the sight of Evie standing in the snow like an avenging angel, it shattered the glass walls of Wyatt's paralysis. The ghost of Josie faded. The burning barn was just a building. Wyatt blinked, sucking in a massive, ragged breath of icy air. His gray eyes snapped into razor-sharp focus. He wasn't in the past, he was in the present, and the woman he loved had just fought for her own life. The ice was gone. The predator returned. Wyatt didn't bother picking up his rifle. He drew his Colt revolver with a speed that defied human reflexes. Silas's 3 remaining thugs, who had paused in shock at seeing their boss taken down by a cook with a frying pan, realized their mistake a second too late. Wyatt moved with lethal, fluid precision. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. 2 of the thugs dropped to the snow, clutching their shoulders and legs. The third threw his hands in the air, dropping his weapon and sprinting into the darkness. Hollis and the returning ranch hands flooded the courtyard, subduing the wounded men and dragging the unconscious, bleeding Silas Vance away from the porch. The gunfight was over in less than 30 seconds. Wyatt holstered his smoking Colt. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at the burning barn, where the roof was finally beginning to cave in, showering the courtyard in harmless sparks. He walked straight toward Evie. She dropped the skillet into the snow. The adrenaline was leaving her body in a violent rush, leaving her trembling so badly her knees buckled. Wyatt caught her before she hit the ground. He hauled her into his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking, a deep, profound tremor that racked his entire frame. "I've got you," Wyatt rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears, kissing the crown of her head, her temple, her soot-stained cheek. "I've got you, Evie. You're safe. I swear to God, you're safe." Evie wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the thick wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of smoke, pine, and the man who had finally come back to her. "You came back," she whispered, her voice cracking. Wyatt pulled back just enough to look down into her eyes. The flames of the dying barn reflected in his gaze, but there was no fear left in him, only a fierce, unyielding devotion. "You brought me back," Wyatt corrected softly, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You fought for me, and I am never ever going to stop fighting for you." He leaned down and kissed her, pressing his mouth to hers amidst the ashes and the snow, sealing a promise that no fire could ever destroy. Dawn did not break over the Sterling Ranch so much as it bled through the thick curtain of smoke. The new barn was nothing but a smoldering, blackened skeleton, hissing angrily as the ranch hands shoveled snow onto the remaining hot spots. But the main house stood untouched, and the horses, though spooked and restless in the outer corrals, were safe. In the center of the muddy, ash-stained courtyard, Silas Vance knelt in the snow. His tailored suit was ruined, soaked in melting frost and his own blood. His jaw was violently dislocated, swelling to the size of a grotesque plum where Evie's cast-iron skillet had connected with devastating force. He groaned, a wet, pathetic sound, his hands tightly bound behind his back with thick rawhide rope. His 3 surviving thugs sat in a miserable row beside him, similarly bound and watched over by a heavily armed Hollis. Evie stood on the porch, a heavy wool blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders. The adrenaline of this night had completely evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the valley road. A posse of riders broke through the morning mist, led by a man wearing the silver star of a United States federal marshal pinned to his heavy canvas coat. Hollis had sent one of the hands riding hard for the settlement the moment the gunfight ended. Marshal Hayes pulled his chestnut gelding to a halt, his keen eyes sweeping over the smoking ruins, the tied-up men, and finally resting on Wyatt, who stood tall and immovable at the base of the porch steps. "Hell of a morning you're having, Sterling," Hayes drawled, dismounting and adjusting his gun belt. He walked over to Silas, nudging the moaning railroad tycoon with the toe of his boot. "Is this the Denver suit the boy told me about?" Wyatt didn't smile, but a grim satisfaction settled into the hard lines of his face. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the heavy copper tube. He unscrewed the brass cap, pulling out the rolled parchment, and handed it to the marshal. "That is Silas Vance," Wyatt said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp carrying over the hiss of the dying fire. "And that ledger is a meticulously documented list of every bribe, extortion, and murder he's orchestrated for the Pacific Railway over the last 5 years. It belonged to his late accountant. He brought an armed posse onto my land last night and set fire to my property trying to get it back." Marshal Hayes unrolled the ledger. As his eyes scanned the columns of damning evidence, a low whistle escaped his lips. He looked down at Silas, who squeezed his eyes shut in agonizing defeat. "Vance," Hayes muttered almost reverently, "there's been a federal bounty on your head for 18 months, but the Pinkertons could never find the paper trail to make it stick." The marshal rolled the ledger back up, his eyes meeting Wyatt's. "The reward for information leading to this man's conviction is $10,000, Wyatt. Issued straight from the governor's office, plus whatever damages a judge awards you for the arson." Evie let out a shaky breath, leaning her forehead against the wooden porch pillar. $10,000. It was more than enough to pay off the bank, rebuild the barn, and secure the ranch for the next decade. The suffocating weight of the 30-day foreclosure vanished into the crisp mountain air. "Get him off my land, Hayes," Wyatt said quietly. "My pleasure." The marshal signaled his deputies, who roughly hauled Silas and his men to their feet, dragging them toward their horses. Silas cast one final, venomous look toward the porch, but his eyes didn't land on Wyatt. They landed on Evie. She didn't shrink back. She didn't drop her gaze. Evie pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared the devil down until he was thrown over the back of a horse and led away into the mist. As the lawmen disappeared down the ridge, the ranch fell into a profound, ringing silence. Hollis and the men began quietly dispersing, leading Toby away to tend to the bruises Silas had left on the boy's neck. They knew their boss needed a moment. Wyatt stood alone in the courtyard, staring at the smoking, blackened timbers of the ruined barn. Evie walked down the porch steps, her boots sinking softly into the ash-dusted snow. She stopped beside him, not speaking, just offering the solid, comforting presence of her body near his. "I thought I was back there," Wyatt whispered, his voice incredibly fragile for a man of his size. His gray eyes were locked on the smoldering wood. When the flames caught, the smell of the smoke, I couldn't breathe. I was back in that night 3 years ago. I thought I was going to watch you burn, just like her. Evie reached out, sliding her small, bruised hand into his massive, calloused one. His fingers instantly intertwined with hers, gripping her like a lifeline. "Josie's death was a lightning strike, Wyatt," Evie said softly, her voice steady and absolute. "It was an act of nature, a terrible, senseless tragedy that no man could have stopped. You've been punishing yourself for 3 years because you thought you weren't fast enough or strong enough to fight an act of God." Wyatt swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working frantically as he fought the emotion rising in his chest. "But last night wasn't an act of God," Evie continued, stepping in front of him, forcing him to look away from the ashes and down into her amber eyes. "Last night was the devil. And when the devil had a gun to my head, you didn't freeze. You broke through your own nightmare. You pulled your weapon and you saved my life." She raised her free hand, pressing her palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his violently beating heart. "You couldn't save her, Wyatt. But you saved me. It's time to put the ghost to rest. You're allowed to live." A single hot tear broke free from Wyatt's eye, cutting a clean track through the soot on his rugged cheek. For 3 years he had worn his guilt like a suit of armor, believing he deserved the crushing weight of it. But looking down at the fierce, beautiful, incredibly brave woman standing in front of him, the armor finally shattered. He didn't need to die on this mountain. He had a reason to live. Wyatt let out a ragged, shuddering breath. He dropped his Winchester into the snow and wrapped both arms around Evie, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of smoke, vanilla, and the intoxicating, undeniable scent of survival. Evie held him fiercely, her hands smoothing over the broad expanse of his back, anchoring him to the present. "I love you," Wyatt rasped against her skin, the words torn from the very depths of his soul. It wasn't a gentle confession, it was a surrender. "God help me, Evie, I love you. You walked out of a blizzard and brought me back to life." Evie closed her eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy spilling over her lashes. The terror of Denver, the brutal journey, the freezing snow, it had all been leading her here, to this exact spot, into the arms of the man she was meant to heal and who was meant to heal her. "I love you too," she whispered, tilting her head back to look at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Wyatt. I'm staying right here." Wyatt didn't say another word. He bent his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and salt, deep and reverent, washing away the shadows of the past and sealing a promise for the future. That night, the door to the master bedroom of the Sterling cabin opened for the first time in 3 years. The cold, empty sheets were finally warmed by the intertwined bodies of 2 survivors. There was no hesitation, no fear. Wyatt touched Evie as if she were made of spun glass, mapping every scar, every bruise, worshipping the strength that had saved his ranch and his sanity. And Evie, who had only ever known the selfish, cold touch of a man who used her, finally learned what it meant to be utterly, completely cherished. The fire in the hearth burned long into the night, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The ice had finally melted. Spring had come to the mountain. 1 year later. The Colorado high country in midsummer was a breathtaking contradiction to its brutal winters. The jagged peaks were capped with brilliant white, but the valleys below were a sea of vibrant, swaying green grass, dotted with wild purple columbine and Indian paintbrush. On the wide wraparound porch of the Sterling cabin, a gentle breeze rustled the homemade bunting strung between the timber posts. There was no grand cathedral. There were no silk gowns, no expensive string quartets, and no high society guests from Denver. Evie wouldn't have had it any other way. She stood on the wooden floorboards, the late afternoon sun catching the golden highlights in her dark hair. She wore a simple, elegant dress of ivory cotton, a bouquet of wild mountain flowers clutched in her hands. Beside her stood Wyatt. He had traded his dusty work denim for a crisp, dark suit, though he still wore his well-oiled leather boots. His dark hair was neatly combed, but the rugged, weather-beaten lines of his handsome face remained unchanged. What had changed, profoundly and permanently, were his eyes. The pale, empty gray that had once haunted his gaze was entirely gone. Today, his eyes were bright, crinkling at the corners with an overwhelming quiet joy as he looked down at the woman beside him. "By the power vested in me by the state of Colorado," the circuit judge announced, closing his small leather-bound Bible, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Wyatt, you may kiss your bride." The small crowd gathered on the porch erupted into cheers. Hollis, wearing a string tie that looked highly uncomfortable around his thick neck, let out a booming whistle. Toby, completely fully healed and grinning from ear to ear, tossed a handful of dried wildflowers into the air. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He dropped his Stetson to the floorboards, pulled Evie flush against his chest, and kissed her soundly, dipping her backward just enough to elicit a breathless laugh from her lips. "Finally," Wyatt murmured against her mouth, a fierce, possessive satisfaction in his voice. "Mine." "Yours," Evie whispered back, her amber eyes shining with tears. "Forever." The celebration that followed was loud, boisterous, and deeply authentic. The ranch hands played fiddles, drank decent whiskey bought with the Vance bounty money, and danced on the grass until the stars began to pierce the twilight sky. The ranch was thriving. The $10,000 reward had cleared all their debts, allowing Wyatt to purchase an additional 500 acres of grazing land and build a new, massive stone foundation barn that no stray spark could ever ignite. As the evening cooled, Evie slipped away from the dancing, stepping into the warmth of the cabin's kitchen. It had been expanded over the winter, boasting a massive new iron stove and wide windows that looked out over the eastern ridge. She walked over to the counter, reaching out to touch the heavy, blackened cast-iron skillet resting on the iron grate. It was clean, well-oiled, and completely devoid of any blood or violence. It was just a pan again. The cracked clay pot was gone, shattered into dust, and the wooden spoon was retired to a decorative hook on the wall. Evie rested her other hand on the gentle, unmistakable curve of her stomach. 4 months pregnant. She was carrying the next generation of the Sterling legacy beneath her heart. The sheer miracle of it still brought tears to her eyes on quiet mornings. Heavy, familiar footsteps sounded on the floorboards behind her. Wyatt stepped into the kitchen, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He didn't say a word as he came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, his large hands coming to rest gently and protectively over hers on her swelling belly. He rested his chin on the top of her head, swaying her gently side to side in the quiet kitchen. "You're missing your own party, Mrs. Sterling," Wyatt murmured, the gravelly rumble of his voice vibrating against her back. "I just needed a moment," Evie said softly, leaning her full weight back against his solid chest, completely at peace. She looked out the window at the silhouette of the mountains against the starry sky. "I was just thinking about the day I walked through those gates. I thought my life was over. I thought this mountain was going to be my grave." Wyatt tightened his arms around her, pressing a lingering, tender kiss to her temple. "It was a grave," he corrected gently. "Until you brought the fire." Evie smiled, closing her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful beat of her husband's heart. She had lost everything to a man built of lies, only to find her entire world in a man built of stone and truth. She had come to this mountain as a desperate beggar pleading for a chance to survive, but in the end, it was the hardened cowboy who owed her his life.